As an historian, how do you look at this moment?
Well, it's a very intense moment. We don't know what's going to happen, obviously. This is a different kind of candidate, a different kind of campaign that they've run where there've been a lot of rancor, a lot of hard words exchanged, and we'll have to see how it all works out, whether people are able to sort of come back and come together.
If past really is prologue, are there any moments in history that you've looked back to as you consider this day?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, an obvious one would be the 1850s with the kind of the antebellum period when people were really at loggerheads. But we've always had these kind of sharp divisions, different understandings about the course of America between urban centers and rural centers and so forth. So there's a familiarity with it. What's different, I would say, is social media and the sort of immediacy of the news cycle that used to be 24-hour when it was cable, and we thought that was a big deal. And now it's minute by minute, it seems.
If you look at history, the social media side, which we can't look at, does it suggest of where we're going or how the Republic stands in a moment like this, where there is such divide?
Well, it depends. We go through cycles, and we seem to be now in a cycle where more conservative views, people would say views of the right are in ascendancy, and that goes for a period of time, and then the pendulum swings back. The question is, we don't know how long it will be.
Yeah. To go back to your role as an historian, I guess first you have a dual role. You're a lawyer and an historian. Mm-hmm. How has that shaped how you look at history?
Well, I think for law, I'm always thinking about process and how things are done. Historians look at evidence, but I think process is less important than it is for lawyers. So I kind of combine both of those things and my approach to my work. And I think it gives me an extra edge when there's a controversy involved, when there's a dispute about a particular matter. I think I can attack it in a particular kind of way.
Is there a sort of an electricity, a joy that you have when you happen upon those?
I love it. I like being a lawyer and a historian. Both of them are similar, are very much like being detectives. And there's a lot of fun in discovering things and pulling pieces out or seeing things that other people missed. And then you can say, aha, I like that.
How do you look at the evidence, which in your case has been well over 100 years old, 150 years old, or 200 years old in the case, of course, of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. How do you look at that and ascertain what is fact?
Well, you look at it and comparing stories, information that you have around it to come to the most reasonable conclusion. I mean, facts are difficult to ascertain, and sometimes people think it's a matter of opinion, but what you have to do really is to look around the thing and to say, what supports this? Does this support it, or does it take away from it or make it seem less credible? History's in the arts, it's an art. It's not a strict science, and so it's hard to apply a particular formula, but you know it when you see it, the feeling that you get when you have amassed enough information to say, aha, I think this is it.
For Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, for instance, as you have illustrated, this had been talked about for many, many years, in 2 centuries. But what gave you the conviction that you understood this was worth pursuing, that this probably was a relationship?
Well, what gave me the conviction was the way historians were writing about it. It was not so much, Tom and Sally, did they have kids? It was, why are historians putting a thumb on the scale when they're looking at this issue? When members of the Jefferson family, the legal white family, says something, it was like, oh, that's probably true. And when Madison Hemings and other enslaved people said something else, it was automatically dismissed. And I knew, and I could find evidence corroborating what Madison Hemings was saying. And on the other side, I could see that the Jefferson family was saying things that weren't true. And that usually shapes how you view credibility. So I was more interested in vindicating the words or the dignity of African American people than I was proving that Tom and Sally had kids. I mean, that's an interesting point, but that happened a lot during slavery. I mean, the DNA testing they've done on African American people shows that the vast majority of us have some white ancestry, and that's from slavery. So that's not it was not an uncommon thing, but this notion of who you believe and who you see as credible has application, not just in history, it has application in day-to-day life. If you believe people because they're a certain class, they're upper class, or if they're poor, you don't, regardless of race, do you treat them equally? And so that's what gave me the conviction, gave me the desire to work on this particular story.
And then you found yourself in the position of continuing to protect Sally Hemings's dignity, because people question things about her intellectual ability and her ability to speak French and made so many assumptions about her.
Yes, well, I think that it's such a telling thing when people would ask me, how did James and Sally Hemings learn to speak French? I mean, they're there for 5 years. If you live in a country for 5 years, and they were young people in particular, pick up language quickly. And so that tells me something, not just what they think about James and Sally Hemings, but what they think about black people in general and enslaved people in general. Are they like other human beings? And these were sort of, in some people, I would imagine, unconscious reactions. And I would say, now look, why couldn't they do this, and talk them through it? But there were lots of moments like that where there were assumptions about the incapacity of African American people that bled over into the way they viewed this story.
We see the skepticism about facts now, the flagrant pushback and denial of facts today, but you were experiencing this in the 1990s when your books in your research was first introduced to the world, confirming this relationship in the children. How did you withstand that skepticism at the time?
Well, you have to have a thick skin about it. I think I was confident in the importance of what it was that I was doing. As I said, sort of vindicating the dignity of African American people. And I knew that there were people who felt that I was out to get Jefferson, which was not true at all. That wasn't the part of it. But if you think you're doing the right thing, and you're doing it, to the best of your ability, and what you're bringing is valuable, the fact that other people aren't on board is less painful, because you know that in the end, and I think I've been borne out on that, the work that I presented has been accepted by most people, and graduate students read it, people assign the book in classes, and I'm always gratified to hear that is something that has struck a chord with people. You just have to say, I think I'm right about this.
Did you take time to think about what the reverberations would be when that was first released, and you understood that this was going to disrupt a lot of people's notions and acceptance of American history?
Not really, because I was sort of in a mania almost about getting this work done, because I thought it was important for the reason I said, the bigger picture of how you view the words of black people. So I didn't think about it. It wasn't until it was done, and then I thought, wait a minute. How is this going to be? How will it be received? I was a law professor. I wasn't in a history department yet, so I was very self-conscious about how historians would act. So I took care to send the manuscript to historians who had gone on record saying they didn't believe the story was true, because I wanted to hear from people who were skeptical of the story, to have them tell me why I was wrong. And so even before the book was published, I had I'd sent it around to people to have it vetted. So that was, and they liked it. I mean, they thought that I was persuasive, and so that was gratifying to me. But in writing it, I didn't think about it at all. Once it was done and I realized it was going to come out, that's when I thought, maybe I should have some people look at this.
How would you characterize now the evolution these 20, almost 30 years later?
Wow, when you say that, I think about how long ago that really was. It's amazing, because the first time I went to Monticello back in 1994, there was nothing about Sally Hemings. And if people asked about it, I'm told from other visitors, they were said, it was poo-pooed, that's not true. And now there's a whole tour, the Hemings family tour, and it feels good to see the guides walk around with a copy of my book with lots of Post-its on it. It's a wonderful feeling. I've often said that I feel like people who grew up playing Little League who end up in the major leagues must feel, because this is something that I have thought about for many years, and in an area that I've thought about many years, and I'm actually getting to do it as a grown-up, and so it's a lot of fun.
You carry, of course, the threads of history into your latest book on Juneteenth as well, and you make the distinction between history and origin stories, that both are very important. How do you see the two in tandem?
Well, origin stories work on emotions, and they try to center people, get people centered in their understanding of who they are and what their culture is all about. And they tend to be positive. I mean, even if it starts out bad, it has a happy ending, because you're sort of, telling yourself who you are and reaffirming who you are. History is more factual, it's more real. We don't, to the extent we can get the facts, and it is not necessarily happy. It's not necessarily something that's meant to always uplift you. Where origin stories tend to be a part of the mythology that people need in order to see themselves as good actors in the world, and to make a connection to the people in their culture. Whereas facts and history, they can tell an unhappy story, a story that's not admirable, and you just have to deal with it. So I think they work on the emotions in a different way.
And keeping on Juneteenth for a moment, how was it to tell some of your story in looking at history, as you do in this book, as a young girl who was the first to integrate her school in Texas, and how that has ultimately, of course, as it would anyone, our life experiences shape us and how we look at the world?
Well, it's interesting to go from being a historian, writing about other people's family, to write about myself as a part of history. It's a minor part of history in my corner of the world, Conroe, Texas, but it's nevertheless a part of history. And it made me feel proud, not as much of myself, but of my parents, because this was really my parents' doing. I'm a figure of history in that small world, but because of decisions that my parents made. And so it made me think about them as a relatively young couple who had grown up in a segregated society, and how this was a strike against that in some way. And it made me feel proud and grateful for their sacrifice, because I know they must have been frightened, but I also think they felt that they were part of a movement. I often think, if I would I do that with my kids, send them to a school that's all white? I mean, even the people who work there, the janitors, everybody was white, until later on, when the Supreme Court strikes down the freedom of choice plan under which this was all accomplished, and then black students joined us. But when I think about that, and I realize these journeys, you have to take the first step, and it just so happened that I was the person chosen to do that. It was not easy, and for that reason, I might hesitate to do it with my kids, but my kids were not born during a time, or not coming of age during a time, when there was a movement. And this is the mid-'60s, and there was the Civil Rights Act had been passed, and the Voting Rights Act. So I don't think they felt alone. They were not making this decision in a vacuum. It was a part of a movement that other people were making sacrifices as well, and they decided to do it.
Aside from your parents, how do you think, or can you look back and see how you as a child survived that moment?
I've never minded being by myself. And I don't know if my parents knew that about me when they decided to send me there. So I think I survived it by, being myself, having, the capacity to jump rope on my own. But I also had people who were actually helpful to me. There were kids, I learned that not everybody's the same, not all white people were the same. There were some kids who came over and offered to play with me, And there were kids, I'm sure, whose parents told them to stay away. But it made me think about my surroundings a lot. You know, I had time to think about it, and because this was such an intense experience, I had to think, why is the world this way? Why is this a big deal that I'm in this school? And, you know, why would there be people who would not want to jump rope or play with me and so forth? So I think it made me think about race, and it made me think about history as the years went by, and I sort of reflected on this time period. I think it gave me a curiosity about that I might not have had if I hadn't had the experience.
You also had a line in this book that stopped me cold when I read it, because I realized, and this was your point, that nobody ever, when we talk about integration in that time, nobody ever talks about the black teachers. Mm-hmm. Your mother was one. Mm-hmm. What did the teachers experience?
Well, there was integration of the children, but not really integration of the administration or the teachers. A number of black teachers were removed from the classroom. My mother was an English teacher, and she got to stay in the classroom, but a number of them were moved out, and it sort of changed the whole, but it had a deep effect upon the community because the teachers were role models, and the teachers lived in the same communities with the students. I mean, I loved my first grade teacher, Mrs. Daughtry, but she lived in a completely different community. I remember jumping rope with some friends, and all of a sudden they just kind of disappeared, and they sort of ran in the house, and I thought, what's going on? And it turned out that Mrs. Dancy, who was one of their teachers, was driving down the street, and they didn't want her to see them outside playing. They were supposed to be inside studying, and so, you know, but that could not happen with Mrs. Daughtry because she wasn't around. She was wonderful, but there was something about having a connection between the community and the teachers and the church, all of those things, that I think was very nurturing for people, and that was lost. I mean, you gained some things, but that was definitely something that was lost.
As I mentioned, of course, your most recent book is on Juneteenth. We began talking about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and the work you did there. Mm-hmm. You were very key to Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday in the mm-hmm. United States. Mm-hmm. How do you look at that legacy?
Well, it's surprising because it's not anything that I ever thought that I would be doing. You know, writing the book was something of a surprise to me. It wasn't a plan. I didn't think that the president was going to, sign the bill. I didn't know that there had been a senator who was holding out to prevent it from becoming a law. But my book came out in May, and the president decided in June, just before Juneteenth, once the guy relented, to sign it, and I actually had the opportunity to go to the White House for the signing. And it was a wonderful occasion. There's not a lot of happy things going on in Washington, not a lot of partisan rancor up there, but that was a day when people on both sides of the aisle thought it was a good thing and were celebrating there at the White House. So it makes me feel good. I feel proud.
I have to say, you're pretty funny in how you write about this too, because at the beginning of the book you say, well, this is kind of my holiday and my community. I'm not sure I wanted to share this. How do you feel now that the society at large recognizes it?
Well, I realized that was a silly feeling to have the proprietary notion about Juneteenth. I think it's good because, you know, the holiday is important, but it's important what people think about the general subject, to understand why it was necessary, you know, how it came about. And it says something about American history, the history of race and the history of slavery in the country, to focus on that day. And so anytime, as a historian, I love it when people are prompted to think about the past and to think about what happened before that brought us to the place where we are now. And this is a perfect holiday for doing that. It's also a perfect family holiday. That's how I remember celebrating it, with members of your immediate family, cousins, relatives, members of the community. So I think it's a holiday that has the capacity to bring people together in a particular kind of way. It's in the summer, which is great. Sort of a teaser for July 4th as well, a back-to-back holidays. And I just think it works very, very well.
There are two final things I'd like to ask you about. Both are big issues, but
Okay.
I'd like to get sort of your surface take on them. And one is the debate over monuments in this country and whether they should come down based on whom they honor. There are those who argue that yes, they should come down because they can re-traumatize people, and then there are those who say that we need to be mindful of our uglier past in this country. How do you look at that?
Well, all of those things are true, and that's the complex thing about history and the complex thing about life. All of those things could be true all at once. So what it requires is, to my mind, deep discussions about this, heartfelt, honest discussions. There are going to be some circumstances where you say, this is just too far. Confederate monuments that send a message of white supremacy, that send a message that black people are less than, in public spaces, on public places, that's not appropriate, I don't think, because you're not supposed to, you can imagine going to a courthouse to get justice, and there's a symbol of white supremacy there, that's a problem. The founders, on the other hand, are people who created a country that we lived in, and they created it under circumstances that were tragic because of the institution of slavery, but there were good things about it as well, and we need to be, I think, an adult enough about it to be able to say, this was a good thing, this was not good, and we need to be honest about how this country started. We don't want to sugarcoat things. And keeping monuments contextualized, I've been asked to and have agreed to do writing that goes alongside monuments that explains, what the difficulty is with Jefferson, for example. Shouldn't hide who it is. And I think that that's a good thing to do as well. All of this, to my mind, the best part about it is to get people to discuss and start talking about this, because it makes us think about our past, and as I've said, gives us some sense of why we are where we are today. So it could be a tough subject, but I think the talking about it is in itself incredibly valuable.
Well, the other tough subject, and I'll ask it in such a way because I know it's obviously an incredibly deep issue, but in terms of starting, again, the issue of reparations. What should this country be doing in that conversation?
Well, I think reparations, it's a moral question, and it makes sense morally. It's difficult practically because of the question of who benefits from them, who should get them. Reparations for slavery is the more difficult one. I think reparations for things that happened after the passage of the 14th Amendment, for things that happened in the 20th century, for which there are living people who were affected by that, housing policy that was deliberately enacted to segregate people, which in turn causes, affects people's educational opportunities, police actions, things of those nature. I would start with that, things from the past that happened in the 20th century that were clear violations of the law, and work our way back. Maybe there's a time period when there will come a time when reparations for slavery can exist in this country, in this very deeply divided country. But I think I would start with the 20th century instances of injustices and violations of the Constitution that should be redressed.
Annette Gordon-Reed, thank you so much for the conversation.
You're very welcome.